Welcome to the Deep Dive. We plunge into some really fascinating topics, trying to bring you the most compelling insights. And today, we're going to explore a theory that really completely upends everything you thought you knew about the past. You know, the philosopher George Santayana once provocatively said, "History is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there." Huh. Well, what if he was actually closer to the truth than we could possibly imagine? Our mission today is to unpack a really audacious claim. What if everything we think we know about ancient and medieval history is wrong? And not just, slightly off, but fundamentally flawed, centuries, maybe even millennia, in error. We're diving to the new chronology theory. This is presented by Russian mathematicians Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky in their big history, fiction, or science series. And we're looking specifically at themes from their volume Crusades and Exoduses.
Right. And the central argument of this new chronology is that the conventional timeline we all learn in school, the one largely developed by Renaissance scholars like Scaliger and Petavius back in the 16th, 17th centuries, Fomenko and Nosovsky say it's just deeply incorrect. They claim it contains loads of what they call phantom duplicates.
Phantom duplicates, what does that mean exactly?
It means the same historical events are described multiple times as if they were different occurrences, repeated, dated to completely different historical eras, sometimes, separated by huge stretches of time.
Wow. Okay, so if our conventional timeline rests on such, shaky ground, according to them, you might be asking, how do Fomenko and Nosovsky arrive at these, frankly, astonishing conclusions? What does their radically reimagined history even look like? And I guess, why has it generated such fierce, intense debate? That's what we're going to explore.
Okay, let's unpack this. This idea of phantom duplicates, it's truly mind-bending. So are they suggesting our entire historical record before, say, the medieval period is basically just a series of distorted echoes? What would that real documented past actually look like then, according to their theory?
That's pretty much it, yeah. According to the new chronology, verifiable documented history begins much, much later than we commonly believe. We're talking around 1000 AD at the absolute earliest.
1000 AD?
Yes, and everything before that is essentially seen as these phantom reflections of later medieval events. It's not that nothing happened, but they argue no accurate record survived. Instead, they were replaced by these duplicates.
Okay, so how does that break down? Is there a structure to this revised timeline? Well, they have this kind of layering idea. Almost everything before 1000 AD is considered entirely phantom duplicates. Then the period between, say, 1000 and 1300 AD, that's a complex mix. It contains some real events that are correctly dated in the mainstream version, but also phantom events whose true dates actually belong much later, like the 14th to 16th centuries.
I see.
And for Fomenko and Nosovsky, the most detailed, the most accurate historical accounts, the true history only really begins around 1300 AD onwards.
That's quite a compression of history.
Yeah.
So if the conventional timeline is built on this foundation of duplicates, how do they propose we reconstruct a veracious history, a true one? How do they sift through these fragments and echoes? What are their guiding principles?
They lay out several. First is what they call the principle of veracity of general concepts. They argued that Scaliger and Petavius, the guys who supposedly built the faulty timeline, couldn't have just invented history from scratch.
Right, they had to build on something.
Exactly. They had to build on some existing tradition. And remnants of this true 14th to 16th century tradition, they say, survive as simple, stable formula or general concepts in later sources, things mainstream historians often just dismiss as medieval myths.
Like what? Can you give an example?
Sure, like the old idea of 3 successive world-dominating kingdoms, Babylonian, Greek, Roman. Fomenko and Nosovsky argue that got stretched out over millennia in the conventional chronology, but originally it was just a medieval concept describing a much shorter period.
Interesting. Okay, what else?
The second principle is geographic localization. They claim that geographical names were really fluid before the printing press and standardized maps. So names like Rome, Jerusalem, Babylon, they weren't fixed locations across all of history.
So Rome wasn't always Rome?
According to them, no. For instance, they point out medieval maps often place Babylon near Cairo in Egypt. They say Jerusalem was once identified with Cyprus, and its modern location is actually known as Alquods. And even Gaul might refer to the Galitsk and Volinsk regions of Russia, not France.
That's quite a shift in geography.
It is. And their third key principle is estimating age by mass publication. The argument here is that the earlier a text was widely published, either printed or mass copied by hand, the older and more trustworthy it is.
Why? What's the logic there?
Because mass copying, they say, makes deliberate, tendentious editing nearly impossible. It kind of freezes the text, preserving the original intent better than a single manuscript might.
That makes a certain kind of sense, if you accept the premise about editing. But wouldn't mainstream historians immediately point to countless handwritten manuscripts that predate widespread printing? How does that fit?
That's a major point of contention, absolutely. Mainstream history relies heavily on those unique manuscripts. Fomenko and Nosovsky tend to view them with more suspicion, favoring things that were clearly disseminated widely and early.
Can you give us a memorable example of this mass publication principle in action for the new chronology?
Definitely. Think about the Bible. Conventionally, we're taught the Old Testament predates the New Testament by centuries, right? Well, based on this principle, the new chronology claims the reverse, essentially. They argue the Gospels, Apostles, and Psalms, parts of the New Testament, are older, dating them to around the 14th century. They think the Old Testament is much more recent, with its final canonization only happening maybe late 16th century, at the Council of Trent.
The Council of Trent.
That late.
That's what they argue. They point to evidence suggesting the Old Testament text was repeatedly edited right up until the 17th century, and they even cite a papal bull from 1231 that apparently forbade reading the Old Testament. To them, this suggests a later, less stable, and maybe more politically motivated origin for the text.
My mind is already spinning with these implications. Okay, so we've got this radically compressed timeline, basically saying documented history kicks off properly in the Middle Ages. But if that's true, then all those towering figures and monumental events from ancient times, Caesar, Cleopatra, Alexander the Great, even Christ himself, where do they fit? This must be where the new chronology truly upends the script. Give us some examples of their most radical reidentifications. This sounds wild. It really is. Well, one of their core claims revolves around what they call the Great Exoduses. They assert that the conventional history textbook contains maybe 13 duplicate historical epochs or exoduses, often tied to a great war like the Gothic War or the Trojan War.
Right.
These, they say, are basically chronological marker points that got copied. And the real originals, they're all post-1000 AD. They highlight maybe 4 primary candidates for these originals. The Epoch of Christ, which they place in the 12th century.
12th century.
The Great or Mongolian conquest of the 14th century, which they think was centered in Russia, like Vladimir and Suzdal Russia. And the Ottoman, or what they call the Ottoman, conquest of the 15th century.
So these major conquests are the real events that got duplicated back into antiquity.
That's the idea. And then there's their redating of Christ in his era. This is probably one of the most shocking parts. They posit the nativity of Christ dates to the 12th century, with the crucifixion potentially happening around 1185 AD.
1185, wow.
And what's fascinating here is their claim about the Crusades. They say the First Crusade, usually dated 1096, but which they also identify with the Fourth Crusade of the 13th century, was actually a direct consequence of the crucifixion.
Wait, a consequence? How?
Well, they argue the infidels being fought were the Judeans because, according to the new chronology, Islam wasn't even a distinct, separate religion back in the 12th century. And they say medieval Passions of Christ documents describe Jerusalem, which they call Judean Rome, being conquered after Christ's crucifixion, reflecting this redated First Crusade.
So just to recap, they're claiming the Crusades are directly tied to Christ's crucifixion in the 12th century, and Islam wasn't even separate then. That completely upends everything.
It absolutely does. If Christ's era is shifted to the 12th century and Islam wasn't yet separate, it implies these major world religions are much younger than we think, and that they were deeply intertwined with medieval power struggles, and their historical separation is a much more recent thing.
It challenges the whole independent historical lineage we assume for Christianity and Islam.
Exactly, suggesting a kind of unified origin that later fragmented. And it gets even more specific. They identify a historical figure, Isaac Christopher, who was a patriarch of Antiochia, killed around 967 AD as a version of Jesus Christ.
A specific historical figure.
Yes. And they point to details surrounding his death, like reports of a solar eclipse, an earthquake, deluge rain things that mirror the gospel accounts. What's more, the Antiochian spear, the holy lance sought by crusaders, they believe that's the actual spear that pierced Christ on the cross.
This is a staggering reimagining. Okay, what about places? You mentioned geographic fluidity. What about the great capitals?
Right, imperial capitals. They claim the ancient imperial capital was actually in Egypt, Alexandria, or what they call Old Rome, until the end of the 11th century. Then it transferred to Tsargrad on the Bosporus, that's Constantinople, or New Rome, in the 11th, 12th century. And this city, Constantinople, was also, according to them, known as Jerusalem and Troy.
Constantinople was Jerusalem and Troy.
That's their claim. And here's a particularly controversial one. The city of Rome in Italy. They argue it was only built in the 14th century.
The 14th century?
Yes. And the papacy, moved there around that time. They contend it was never the capital of a global empire in antiquity. Later still, they say the capital moved again further north to Novgorod the Great, which they identify with the Vladimir and Suzdal regions of Russia.
Okay, if even Rome and Constantinople are redated and recentered like this, what does that mean for other famous ancient sites? The ones we, literally dig out of the ground. What about, say, the Egyptian pyramids or the location of Jerusalem itself?
Good questions. For the pyramids, they assert the oldest ones date from the 10th to 11th century AD. And the really big ones, including Cheops, were actually built much later, 14th to 17th centuries. And get this, they suggest they were built using a kind of concrete.
Concrete, not massive stone blocks.
That's their argument. And the whole mummification custom, they suggest it developed because dead emperors whom they identify as czars or khans from this later empire were transported back to Egypt from their new capitals for burial.
Okay, and Jerusalem. If it wasn't the modern city for them initially.
Right. They claim the biblical Jerusalem, where Christ was crucified, wasn't the modern city, but actually Constantinople, modern Istanbul. They identify Mount Beykoz, a suburb of Istanbul, as Golgotha. There's even a symbolic grave there of Saint Yusha, which they equate with Jesus.
And Solomon's Temple.
They identify the famous Hagia Sophia in Constantinople as the biblical Temple of Solomon. They point to medieval sources like Anthony of Novgorod around 1200 AD, describing it as containing things like Moses' law tablets and manna.
So Hagia Sophia is Solomon's Temple in this view.
That's the identification they make. And in terms of biblical territories, they propose Israel refers to the Christian empire of the 11th, 13th century, and then later the great Mongolian empire of the 14th, 16th century, centered in Russia Horde. Judea, in their view, is identified with Asia Minor and the Balkans, with Constantinople as its capital.
This recasts religion pretty fundamentally too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Beyond just the timeline of Christ.
Oh, absolutely. Very radical religious recasting. They suggest the Hebraic language of early ecclesiastical texts wasn't Hebrew as we know it, but originally Egyptian hieroglyphs used between the 11th and 16th centuries.
Hieroglyphs.
Yes. Later replaced by the Greek alphabet from the 13th to 15th centuries. They even claim there are thousands of square meters of untranslated hieroglyphs in Egyptian temples that might actually be this Hebraic version of the Bible. They also look at language. They argue the Church Slavonic word for Jew, which is yevri, originally just meant priest eyrie and wasn't an ethnic or religious distinction at first. And they claim the Christian church remained basically united until the 15th century. Only then did it split into four main branches: Orthodox, Catholic, Muslim, and Judean. They even suggest Islam and Orthodox Christianity were essentially a single religion until the late 16th or 17th centuries.
A single religion until the 1600s.
That's the claim. Finally, just to round out the picture, they make this bold assertion about the Roman Empire. They say the ancient Roman Empire we read about is actually the 13th to 16th century Great Mongolian Empire, centered in Russia, Vladimir, and Suzdal.
So the Roman Empire was Russian.
Essentially, yes, or a Russian horde empire. Ancient Roman emperors are just phantom reflections of Russian czars or khans. And the traditional Tartar and Mongol invasion of Russia, they flip it. It wasn't an invasion of Russia, but a punitive operation by the Russian horde ancestors of modern Russians, who also spoke Turkic languages against regions that were dodging taxes.
Okay, it's a monumental reimagining of pretty much everything. And it relies on some very specific, let's say, scientific methods to support these claims. How do Fomenko and Nosovsky actually claim to prove all this?
Yeah.
What are the tools in their arsenal?
Well, they primarily rely on statistical and astronomical methods. One approach is statistical correlation of texts. They basically analyze patterns of information density, how much space authors devote to certain events in different historical narratives. They claim to find high correlations between periods traditionally seen as separate, like ancient Rome and medieval Rome, which to them suggests duplication.
So if two histories spend about the same amount of page space on similar types of events, they might be the same story.
That's the rough idea, yes. Another method is statistical correlation of dynasties.
Hmm.
Imagine creating a kind of profile or code for every ruler, not DNA, but things like how long they ruled, how they died, maybe major events. Fomenko and Nosovsky use statistics to compare these profiles across supposedly unrelated dynasties, like the kings of ancient Israel and the Western Roman emperors. They claim to find patterns that are just too similar to be coincidence, suggesting they're actually the same rulers or dynasties, just copied and redated. They use sources like J. Blair's chronological tables from the early 19th century, believing these older tables show the joins more clearly.
Right, looking for statistical echoes between dynasties. And what about the astronomy? That sounds crucial.
It is. Their most, let's say, controversial methods involve astronomical evidence. They redate astronomical events described in ancient texts. For instance, they look at lunar acceleration, how the moon's movement relative to Earth changes over long periods, affecting eclipse timings. Mainstream science finds a certain curve fitting ancient data. Fomenko and Nosovsky argue that if you ignore the earliest data points, which they say are flawed, the acceleration looks constant only from about 1000 AD onwards.
Suggesting the pre-1000 data is unreliable or misdated.
Exactly. They also identify the star Bethlehem with a supernova recorded in 1140 AD, and the crucifixion eclipse. They link it to a total solar eclipse observed in 1170 AD.
So specific astronomical events get redated to fit their timeline.
Precisely. They also claim Ptolemy's famous Almagest star catalog, usually dated around 150 AD, was actually compiled much later, 15th-16th century, using data spanning the 9th to 16th centuries. They also redate things like the Dendera zodiacs in Egypt to the 11th or 13th century AD. And they argue many ancient astronomical records are just useless for dating because eclipses recur or the records are too vague or inconsistent.
These claims are, well, they're extraordinary, to say the least, a complete departure from established historical methods. So what does the academic world, the traditional historians and scientists say about all this? How has the new chronology been received?
Well, to put it mildly, it's universally rejected by mainstream scholars. They pretty much brand it as pseudoscience. In Russia itself, it's often seen as kind of an embarrassment in academic circles, and some critics in the West link it to renewed Russian imperial ideology.
Okay, so strong rejection.
Right.
What are the specific criticisms? You mentioned Fomenko dismisses standard dating methods.
Right. Mainstream critics obviously push back hard on that. Fomenko dismisses archaeology, dendrochronology, tree ring dating, paleography, study of ancient writing, and radiocarbon dating as non-exact and contradictory. He claims there's no reliable independent evidence before the 11th century. He points to supposed breaks in tree ring sequences around 1000 AD, and he goes so far as to accuse radiocarbon labs of, quote, fiddling and fine-tuning to get the dates to order of historians.
That's a serious accusation against scientific practice.
It is. He also rejects numismatic dating based on coins as circular reasoning.
And what's the counter-argument from the mainstream scientists to these direct challenges?
Well, archaeologists and scientists strongly defend their methods. They emphasize that independent tree ring sequences go back way further than Fomenko claims, over 12,400 years in some areas. And these sequences are consistently cross-validated by radiocarbon dating, creating robust calibration curves with known minimal error margins. They also explain that providing an estimated age when submitting a sample, which Fomenko criticizes, is actually part of a rigorous process to ensure the correct testing procedures are used, and it's all part of a system of cross-validation. The convergence of multiple independent dating methods is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
Okay, so disagreement on the validity of fundamental dating techniques. What else?
Critics also accuse Fomenko of, well, blatant misuse of historical sources and what they call forced pattern matching. They say he's highly selective, cherry-picking sources, ignoring basic principles of sound historical scholarship, and that he essentially forces the data, rearranging lists of rulers, merging figures, even removing monarchs, just to make them fit his statistical patterns.
And you give a specific example of that.
Sure. His identification of Jesus with Pope Gregory VII is often cited. Critics say he ignores huge differences in their life stories and known biographies, focusing only on very superficial parallels, like both being associated with baptism upon taking office.
So ignoring context to find patterns.
That's the accusation. Furthermore, critics highlight selectivity in his use of astronomical phenomena. They argue Fomenko picks isolated examples that seem to support his theory while ignoring the vast body of astronomical data that validates conventional dating.
Like what, for instance?
Well, take Ptolemy's Almagest star catalog. His redating relies on looking at only 8 stars, one of which apparently has a known large error in its recorded position. And he incorrectly assumed the Earth's tilt, its obliquity, was constant over time, which it isn't. In stark contrast, mainstream astronomers point to things like Babylonian cuneiform astronomical diaries. These records date events like eclipses down to a single day, and they consistently match the accepted chronology back to at least the 6th century BCE. Fomenko tends to dismiss this kind of evidence.
So conflicting interpretations of the astronomical record, too.
Deeply conflicting. And finally, there's the sheer scale of the conspiracy theory implied here. Fomenko claims that basically all of world history before 1600 was deliberately falsified, mostly for political reasons, by Western European scholars in the 16th and 17th centuries, and that all the documents supporting his views were systematically destroyed.
That would have to be an unbelievably vast and successful conspiracy.
Exactly. Critics point out the absurdity of such a huge, perfectly coordinated global conspiracy succeeding with such consistency, especially given, for example, the immense number of ancient coins found all over the world. They consistently match traditional chronologies, bearing names and dates that would all have to be part of this grand fabrication.
Right. It does stretch credulity.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, despite all these strong criticisms from academia, the new chronology has found a surprisingly large audience, hasn't it? You mentioned it sold over 1 million copies in Russia, and even Garry Kasparov, the famous chess champion, has expressed some support.
That's true. Kasparov apparently found it illogical, or questioned why the Byzantines wouldn't seem to use all the mounds of scientific knowledge supposedly available from ancient Greece and Rome, implying a kind of historical break or inconsistency that resonated with Fomenko's ideas. And Fomenko himself, or at least his publisher, has stated that he'd be open to retracting his theories. If radiocarbon dating passes certain black box tests he proposes, or if astronomy definitively refutes their specific eclipse results.
But the mainstream doesn't accept those challenges.
No. Mainstream historians and scientists generally don't accept these specific challenges because they argue the scientific methods already in place are rigorous, have been tested for decades, and work based on established scientific principles. They essentially see Fomenko's demands as misunderstanding or rejecting how scientific validation actually works.
Well, this deep dive has certainly shown us a theory that challenges almost every pillar of established historical understanding. It's quite something. It's definitely a vivid reminder that history, far from being just a static collection of facts, is a constantly evolving interpretation of the past. Or at least interpretations can vary wildly.
Absolutely. And whether you accept the new chronology or dismiss it completely, it certainly forces you, or encourages you at least, to ask big questions, to scrutinize the foundations of the historical narratives we've all inherited. It really raises an important question, doesn't it? What does it even mean to be well-informed about the past when there can be such fundamental, radical disagreements about the timeline itself?
Yeah. We've navigated claims of phantom duplicates, shifting capitals, ancient Rome being in Russia, Christ in the 12th century. It's a lot. What stands out to you, the listener, from this exploration? How do you weigh the methods and arguments presented by the new chronology against the overwhelming consensus of mainstream academia? It's a really deep question, and maybe one worth diving into further on your own.